One man breaks from a wall of players and sprints toward the ball. The referee has not blown his whistle. The kick has not been taken. The opposing team stands still, waiting. And then he kicks it, hard, down the field, completely away, as if his life depends on it. That moment, a World Cup free kick, interrupted by a defender with no tactical reason to do what he did, has been replayed for 50 years. Sports television has filed it into every list of bizarre moments the game has produced. Commentators have called it inexplicable. Coaches have screened it as an example of what not to do. Football fans from Sao Paulo to Seoul have forwarded it around as the clip that makes no sense. But the man who kicked that ball, the defender Mwepu Ilunga, was not confused about the rules of football. He had been playing professionally for years. He had qualified for this tournament. He knew exactly what a free kick was, what a wall was, and what the referee expected to happen next. What the cameras in that West German stadium could not capture was what was waiting for him and his teammates if they left the tournament, having humiliated the man who had sent them there. And in Zaire in 1974, humiliation was not an abstract concept. It was a documented hazard. This is the story of Zaire at the 1974 World Cup, the first sub-Saharan African team ever to play at football's largest event. A team that arrived as the living proof of a dictatorship's power, carried the weight of an entire continent's pride, and produced the strangest, most debated, most misunderstood act in the tournament's history. And when you understand the world those men were operating inside, what had been promised, what had been threatened, what home meant for a man holding a Zairean passport in the summer of 1974, the act stops being a punchline. It becomes a document. It becomes evidence of something the highlight reel was never designed to show you. Now, the version that was sold to the world. In the months leading up to June 1974, the capital Kinshasa had erupted. Flags hung from windows. State radio announced qualification results in tones usually reserved for military victories. The national team, known as the Leopards, had done something the continent had never produced before. They had qualified for the World Cup. Not through a lucky draw or an administrative shortcut. They had beaten their opponents across the African qualifying rounds and earned the right to stand alongside the established powers of world football on the largest stage the sport possessed. The president of Zaire, the man who controlled the country's army, its media, its courts, and its official calendar, appeared alongside the players in state photographs. His name, as he had chosen it, was Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngendu wa Zabanga, a name he had assigned to himself, one that translates roughly as the all-powerful warrior who moves from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. Before he renamed himself, his name had been Joseph Desire Mobutu. Before his country was Zaire, it had been the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The renaming was not administrative. It was ideological. Mobutu had come to power through a military coup in 1965, in the chaotic years that followed Belgian colonial withdrawal from Central Africa. By 1974, he had been in power for nearly a decade, and he had constructed a system around a single organizing idea he called authenticité, authenticity. The ideology demanded a total rejection of the colonial past. European names were stripped from cities, from institutions, from people. Kinshasa replaced the colonial name Leopoldville. Citizens were ordered to take African names. The Catholic Church was pushed to the margins. Western business clothing was discouraged in official settings in favor of a jacket style Mobutu himself popularized, derived from a French phrase meaning "down with suits." His own image, wearing his signature leopard skin hat, appeared on banknotes, in government offices, in classrooms across the country. Authenticité was, on one level, a genuine response to the actual violence of colonialism, an attempt to rebuild a cultural identity that had been systematically dismantled over generations. There was something real in the impulse, something that connected to a broad, lived experience across the continent of having your history, your language, your name, treated as inferior by foreign administrators with guns. On another level, it was a political instrument of considerable precision. If everything good was African, and Mobutu was Africa's defining leader, then everything good was Mobutu's achievement. The World Cup team was the cleanest possible expression of this equation. Young African men playing a game the entire world watched, wearing the colors of a country Mobutu had named, succeeding in front of cameras that broadcast everywhere. The Leopards were not amateurs imported for the occasion. The squad contained players who competed at professional levels in Europe and across Africa. They had won the African Cup of Nations, continental champions, and had qualified through a competitive process against nations that wanted the same place on the stage. Within African football, Zaire was taken seriously. What was new was the global stage. What was new was the scale of the cameras, and what was new was the degree to which the government had decided that the team's performance was not simply a matter of sport. Before they flew to West Germany, the players were given instructions that went beyond tactics. They were told what it meant to be there. They were told who they represented. Financial incentives were promised. Conditional, the players understood, though the exact conditions were never written into documents that later became public. What was understood by the players in that room was that the expectations attached to this tournament were not the ordinary expectations of competitive sport. A certain dignity was required. A certain result was expected. Losing was conceivable. Something else was not. Group 2 of the 1974 World Cup was a draw that would have been difficult for any African team appearing at this level for the first time. Zaire would face Scotland, a nation with professional football infrastructure stretching back to the Victorian era, with players competing in the top divisions of Britain and Europe. They would face Yugoslavia, one of Europe's most technically developed footballing cultures, a nation that had been producing serious international players for generations. And they would face Brazil. Brazil were, in the literal documentary sense, the most decorated team in the history of the sport to that point. They had won the World Cup in 1958, in 1962, and again in 1970. That third title claimed in Mexico in a manner so dominant, a campaign so consistently brilliant, that FIFA awarded them permanent possession of the Jules Rimet Trophy, the original cup. For the 1974 tournament, a new prize had been cast. Brazil arrived in West Germany, fully intending to own it too. Zaire played Scotland first. They lost 2-0. In a group that contained Brazil and Yugoslavia, this was not unreasonable. Scotland were dangerous, organized, experienced opponents, and a 2-goal margin was survivable in a tournament context if subsequent results went differently. The Leopards had competed. They had played. There were things to build on. Then came Yugoslavia. The 9 goals arrived over 90 minutes, some in pairs, in an accumulation that transformed a football match into something that begins, at a certain point, to feel like erasure. Yugoslavia had qualified from the same European group as West Germany. They were technically sophisticated, physically prepared, and, this matters, already knowing that a defeat to Scotland in their other group match meant they were playing this game for goal difference. For Yugoslavia, the margin was tactical. For Zaire, the margin was an emergency. By the time the final whistle registered 9-0 on the scoreboard, the match had stopped being a sporting event. It had become a number that everyone inside and outside the Zairean delegation was calculating against other numbers, against the faces of the men who had spoken to them before the tournament, against the concept of what constituted acceptable performance and what constituted something worse. What happened inside the Zairean camp in the days between that result and the Brazil match has been reconstructed through interviews and reported testimony collected over the following decades, including from players who spoke to journalists long after the tournament ended. The picture that emerges is consistent, even where specific details vary in their telling. After the Yugoslavia match, promised bonuses were withheld. Government representatives made contact with the delegation. The language used was the language of consequence, not phrased as explicit threat, but understood as such by men who lived in a system where the distinction between implicit and explicit barely existed. Here is the thing about threat in a closed political system. It does not need to be spelled out to function. You do not need a document bearing a minister's signature with a punishment listed in paragraph 3. What you need is for the people receiving the message to understand that the person sending it can deliver on whatever is implied, and has done so before, to people who gave cause. Mobutu's security apparatus was documented, operational, and well understood by every Zairean who carried a passport with his face printed on it. The players did not need the threat to be specific. The ambiguity was precisely the instrument. Several members of the 1974 squad did not return to Zaire when the tournament ended. That is not speculation. That is on record. So Zaire arrived to face Brazil having lost 9 goals in their previous match, having received a message from home that carried weight beyond football, and carrying the particular arithmetic of men who understood that the scoreboard had implications their opponents could not imagine, and the cameras would not film. Brazil scored early, then again, then a third time. 3 goals, and the match was entering its final quarter with Zaire exhausted, already eliminated, playing out a result that confirmed what the group had always suggested. And then Brazil were given a free kick, somewhere in the final 10 or so minutes. The Zairean wall arranged itself. Ilunga took his place in it. The Brazilian players positioned themselves for the set piece. The referee measured the distance with his boot. Everything was proceeding according to the rules of football as understood by every person in that stadium. And then Mwepu Ilunga ran forward out of the wall and kicked the ball hard, far away from the scene, away from the goal, away from Brazil's next opportunity. The referee showed him a yellow card, a booking for deliberate interference with an opposing team's set piece. The Brazilian players turned to each other in disbelief, then to the referee, seeking an explanation for what they had just witnessed. In the press boxes, journalists scrambled for language. In the following 50 years, the clip circulated as comedy. The inexplicable African footballer, the man who didn't understand the rules. If this is changing how you see that moment, if the punchline is beginning to look like something else entirely, hit like. It tells us this kind of story is worth digging for. Because what came after that yellow card was never meant to become part of the public record. Mwepu Ilunga gave interviews over the following decades. In one that received attention not proportional to what he said in it, he was direct. He said he understood the free kick. He said every player in that wall understood the free kick. He said what was running through his mind in that moment was not confusion about the rules of football, but a belief shared inside that changing room, built on something real, that conceding another goal might cross a threshold that could not be crossed safely, that some number of goals against Brazil meant something different at the airport than 3 goals against Brazil meant. Whether the number was 4 or 5 or simply any additional one above what already existed on the board, he could not say with certainty. The ambiguity was the point. When you do not know exactly where the line is, you do not step toward it. Brazil scored no 4th goal. The match ended 3-0. The tournament was over for Zaire. The government issued statements in tones that were entirely predictable. Pride and participation, the historic achievement of being present, the beginning of a long journey, Africa's growing presence on the world stage. Mobutu's media apparatus did what media apparatuses in closed systems do. It located the version of the story that served the larger story being told. Several players flew home. Several did not. Mwepu Ilunga continued playing professional football for years afterward. He lived for decades after that West German summer. He died in 2020, and the obituaries that appeared, when they appeared at all, mentioned the yellow card. Few of them mentioned what he had said about the yellow card. There is a layer beneath the fear that is worth sitting with, because the story of the 1974 Leopards does not belong exclusively to Mobutu's ambitions and the pressures they generated. It belongs also to the men who played those matches, and to what their presence on that pitch meant to people who had nothing to do with the dictatorship. Across the continent, in countries with their own histories and their own politics, the news of Zaire's qualification had traveled like electricity through football communities. This was the first time a team from sub-Saharan Africa had stood on the planet's largest sporting stage. People who had no particular affection for Mobutu's regime, people who lived under different governments or under no government they had chosen. They watched those matches the way you watch something that contains a version of yourself. The players knew this. They carried both weights simultaneously, the weight of a dictator's expectations and the weight of a continent's investment. Those two things arrived in the same uniform and could not be separated by the viewer in the stands, by the cameras, or sometimes even by the men wearing the shirt itself. The mechanism this story exposes is older than Zaire and older than the World Cup, and it functions across the full spectrum of governmental arrangements, not merely in authoritarian systems, though authoritarian systems use it most nakedly. A government hosting or competing in a major sporting event understands something that is simply and documentably true. A crowd leaving a stadium believing in their nation is a political resource that no speech can reliably manufacture. The celebration is genuine. The emotion is genuine. The flags are not theatrical. They are sincere expressions of something the leader did not create but intends to borrow. The leader's job is to be standing close enough to the trophy that the emotion transfers. Mussolini appears in the documented record of the 1934 World Cup, hosted in Italy, won by Italy, refereed through a bracket whose progression generated the outcome the host government had strongly desired. Foreign correspondents filed reports noting the atmosphere around certain matches. Italian journalists wrote of pressure applied through channels that had nothing to do with the rulebook. Italy won. The fascist state announced that the victory demonstrated what the regime had been saying about Italian civilization, Italian discipline, Italian destiny. The cup proved the ideology. That was the point of the cup. In Argentina in 1978, a military government that had taken power through a coup 2 years earlier hosted and won the World Cup. Political prisoners were held in detention facilities whose locations placed them within audible distance of at least one stadium hosting tournament matches. The outside world watched the football. Documents released in subsequent years, Argentine government records, Brazilian intelligence assessments, Peruvian parliamentary investigations, raised pointed and formally recorded questions about a particular match in which Argentina needed to beat Peru by a very large margin to advance in the tournament, and did so by 6 goals to nothing. Peru's goalkeeper in that match was a nationalized Argentine citizen. Peruvian legislative committees examined the circumstances for years. Nothing was ever conclusively proven in a court. The questions remain in the documented record permanently. These are not theories requiring imagination to sustain. They are patterns applied by governments that understood what sporting triumph could do domestically, and that were operating in systems where the means available to them extended well beyond the rulebook the sport believed governed proceedings. The pattern recurs because the incentive never changes. A championship, arriving at the right moment, can do things that press releases cannot. This is what makes the 1974 moment in West Germany so much more than a clip. It is a window into the space between the game and the forces surrounding the game, a space that is usually invisible, usually deniable, usually safely filed in the category of speculation. What Mwepu Ilunga did was make that space visible, involuntarily, in real time, on camera. He stepped out of the choreography for a moment and showed the audience something the broadcast was not designed to transmit. He was not a symbol. He was a person, a professional footballer who had earned his place on that stage, who had trained, traveled, and competed through a qualifying campaign that had taken months. He stood in a wall on a grass pitch in West Germany on a June afternoon and did arithmetic that had nothing to do with football. He calculated the certain, bounded cost of a yellow card against the uncertain, unbounded cost of the number on the board climbing higher. He chose the yellow card. That is not inexplicable. That is rational behavior inside a system designed to make all behavior rational in the direction of power. The irrationality belonged to the system, not the man. The World Cup is on the ground now, in the United States, in Mexico, in Canada, the largest stage the tournament has ever occupied, spread across cities and climates and time zones that span a continent. New fans are forming their first impressions of what international football is, what it means, why billions of people orient their summers around it. The stadiums are full. The television numbers are historic. The commercial operation surrounding the event is larger than any previous edition in its history. And governments from every continent have made their calculations. Leaders will appear in boxes above the pitch. Official media will connect goals scored to projects of national renewal, however those projects are currently branded. Somewhere, in a changing room that the broadcast cameras cannot enter, players will be having conversations about things that have nothing to do with their formation. The question the 1974 Zaire story leaves, the one that 50 years have not closed, is simpler than it looks. The clip has lived in the category of football comedy for half a century. Giving it its real context does not make it less strange. It makes it stranger. Because what the clip actually contains is a man performing a rational act inside an irrational situation. A man who understood the rules perfectly and chose to break one of them because a different, unwritten set of rules was operating at a level the referee had no authority over. The game is not only what the cameras can see, it never has been. When you watch the next free kick in a World Cup stadium, when the wall assembles and the referee marks the distance and the crowd holds its breath, consider for a moment what you do not know about the men standing in that line. What they were told before they arrived here. What is waiting for them if the wrong number ends up on the board? What calculation they might be running through their heads in the 4 seconds between the referee's whistle and the kick. Mwepu Ilunga ran out of the wall and kicked a ball away in the 81st minute of a dead match, and the world laughed for 50 years. The laughter was understandable. It was also the sound of not looking closely enough. The tournament goes on. It always does. The question is whether, this time, we're watching the right thing.